So we're basically going to finish up the heart. We've talked a bunch about it, but there's still a few more things to talk about. Then we are going to do blood vessels. We're going to look at them both kind of more as kind of the kind of lecture-y kind of, what is a blood vessel? What are the different layers? What tissues make up the blood vessel? But then we're also going to do kind of the gross anatomy. Anatomy of the blood vessels. And we're going to just learn a number of arteries and veins and their names and all that. So those are the major things we're doing today. And then depending on how much time we have, we still have blood itself to deal with. Basically, we're talking a little bit about the plasma, the liquid part of the blood, and the cells, we call the formed elements. Oh.
So will the exam be on Tuesday?
Yeah, the exam is still scheduled for Tuesday. I think that should work. So, and my stylus seems to be dead. All right. So let us go back to the heart. Oh, come on. So here was the heart with the ventricles. Okay, hold on. Let me try that again. So the heart, which had the ventricle, the atria, the ventricles. We saw, remember, the left ventricle has much thicker walls and also tends to kind of go more down all the way to the apex. The right atrium and ventricles are not as beefy here. We have much thinner walls with the right ventricle. We saw coming out of the top, we've got the aorta. You've got the pulmonary trunk also coming out of the top here. So this should look pretty familiar from last class. What I didn't talk about last class were the different layers that make up the heart. And so let's talk about that now. The inner part of the heart, the lining of the ventricles and the atria, gets the name endocardium. It's the same stuff that lines all of your blood vessels. What was the tissue that lines the inside of all your blood vessels?
Simple squamous?
It's simple squamous, which we also called endothelium. So the endocardium is just more simple squamous epithelium, but that's lining the inside of your heart instead of lining the inside of blood vessels. The actual kind of meat of the heart that's going to be called the myocardium. Right, myo meaning, remember, myo is muscle. So this is basically cardiac muscle. And also connective tissue that helps reinforce parts of it. So we call the fibrous skeleton of the heart. That if you remember, so this fibrous skeleton of the heart kind of really anchors where the valves are. So it really holds on to the AV valves and the semilunar valves, which are all kind of right in kind of that plane in the middle of the heart. This fibrous skeleton of the heart also electrically isolates the atria from the ventricles, and that is going to become important in a few moments. Maybe I type that in as well. So if you remember smooth muscle, do you remember how smooth muscle had gap junctions? So if you excite one cell, the other cell gets excited. You know, cardiac muscle has gap junctions. If you excite one cardiac muscle cell, all its neighbors get excited. So cardiac muscle cell has little gap junctions in between. So in general, if you excite some cells of the heart, that electrical excitation spreads across to all its neighbors. But because we have this fibrous skeleton of the heart electrically isolating the atria from the ventricles, if we electrically stimulate the atria, they'll all co-excite each other, but it won't automatically spread down to the ventricles without a special conducting pathway, which we're going to talk about. So this is important. This electrical excitation of the atria and the ventricles will be important in a few moments when we talk about how the heartbeat is coordinated.
Are you saying
So
the fibrous skeleton is the one that does that?
yeah, it's kind of connective tissue that separates the cardiac muscle cells of the atria from the cardiac muscle cells of the ventricles.
Okay, thank you.
All right, and then the other thing we need to add into our picture here. So we have the myocardium is kind of the meat. The endocardium is the lining in the inside. But then we have the outer part. And what is the name of the serous membrane that surrounds the heart? We talked about this in the very beginning of the semester.
Mediastinum?
That was the name of the cavity around, no, it's not the mediastinum.
Pericardium?
Pericardium, the pericardium. So the pericardium is the serous membrane that surrounds the heart. It's going to be a double layer. So there's going to be one layer that's on the heart muscle itself. So this layer I just drew here, we could think of it two ways. This can either be our visceral pericardium, you know, the layer of the serous membrane that's against the organ. In the case of the heart, this also is called the epicardium. Epi meaning kind of above the heart. So sometimes they call it epicardium as the simple squamous epithelium layer that's right on top of the heart. I think it's, it's more intuitive to just think of it as the visceral pericardium. Obviously, each serous membrane has two layers. There's the visceral layer and there's a parietal layer. So this is going to be the parietal layer of the pericardium. That's kind of what I drew in blue, even rhymes. I drew in blue. Visceral layer is in green here. Obviously, like any kind of serous membrane, it's got serous fluid in the middle, so keeps the heart as it's beating and undulating from rubbing itself raw against your lungs and your ribs and all the other stuff in your mediastinum. The one thing that's unique about the serous membrane around the heart is that the parietal layer has an extra reinforcing fibrous connective tissue layer. So the parietal layer has this fibrous pericardium that is like that. So when you think about the heart, it's kind of, best way is think about it being in a little leathery bag with a slick lining. So this fibrous pericardium, let me use a black maybe. The fibrous pericardium and this parietal layer here together, these together become what we call the pericardial sac. So it's basically this fibrous layer, dense, irregular connective tissue, basically like, the dermis, like leather, kind of a leathery bag with this slippery parietal layer of the pericardium inside, and then the heart. So if you, again, this is where it's kind of sad, where we're not going to actually look in the cadaver. When you open the cadaver, if you crack somebody's heart or chest open, you don't see the heart. What you see instead is a little leathery bag with something oozing and pulsing inside the bag. And then you have to slit the little bag open, and inside the bag, you see the heart. So this pericardial sac is basically it's this fibrous layer, this more leathery layer that is there, and then the parietal layer, the slippery serous membrane. And so this is the basic way the heart is wrapped in its serous membrane and how it keeps from rubbing itself against all this stuff. One of the books I read says the heart beats about 3 billion times during your lifetime. So it's 3 billion. Ooh, 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 ooh. You need to have some good protection against friction if you're going to rub against your chest 3 billion times during your lifetime. So that is that pericardial sac. Again, the tip of the heart we call the apex. Apex is actually a bit to the left. The heart, maybe 2/3 of the heart is left of your midline. The place where the apex of the heart kind of touches the front. Oh, come on. I'm going to let my stylus recharge while I talk here. In a guy, at least like about 2 centimeters below your left nipple is this place they call the point of maximal intensity. And that's basically where the apex of the heart is kind of lying against the body wall. Like if you want to put a stethoscope on somebody and hear like a really thump, 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 you know, that point of maximal intensity is where you're going to get the loudest sound, because it's kind of where this, you know, the left ventricle, the apex of the heart is basically kind of up against the front of your body. You know, if you actually want to listen, auscultate other valves or other things, you can actually move the stethoscope around to different areas, and you can preferentially hear sounds from other parts of the heart. But if you just want to hear the loudest possible heartbeat, you kind of put it a couple of centimeters below the left nipple, and that's where kind of the heart is up against your body wall. So let us continue then. So we're going to talk now about what we call the intrinsic conduction system of the heart. So I don't know if do people fish? Has anybody ever like caught a fish and gutted it while, you know, right after it's been killed? And you take a fish and you like snap its neck and you slice its belly open. Anybody ever done that?
I've never snapped a fish's neck by killing it. I've like stabbed it, but I have filleted a fish before.
What do you see when you like spill out its guts right after it's just died moments ago?
Well, you can see, I don't think I've ever seen a fish heart actually.
Okay, maybe when I was a kid, I'd always go fishing with my dad, and we would catch trout and either snap their neck or whack them against a rock and then slit them open. And it was always kind of freaky that the heart kept beating, even though it was outside of the fish.
In halibut, they're just like, it's like all in a sack.
Well, I've seen like the biggest the part inside the fish. It's kind of like a conical shaped balloon, like a air sac.
So there's some fish have air sacs. This is different. We're talking about the heart right now. So the heart beats maybe I should have just gone straight to the crux here. The heart beats on its own without any input from the nervous system. If this was some zombie, maybe I should have gone with the zombie movie. If this was a zombie movie and I was going and I just reached into somebody's chest and pulled out their heart and held it in front of me, it would keep beating in front of me in my hand. Because the heart has its own cells within it that are coordinating and stimulating the cardiac muscle cells to do the heartbeat. The nervous system, we know that the autonomic nervous system has some control, but all it does is like speed it up or slow it down. It doesn't actually generate the basic rhythm. So what we're going to talk about now is the parts of the heart that generate the actual heartbeat. And let's do that. Again, here's the heart. There are specialized cells up in it's in the wall. It's not actually in the atrium, but it's in the wall in the right atrium here. And this is going to be called my sinoatrial node. Often just called the SA node. And sometimes it's just called the pacemaker. This is the part of the heart that is going constantly. All the cardiac muscle actually is what we call autorhythmic, but the pacemaker node is what sets the pace for everything and kind of entrains, kind of coordinates it all. So autorhythmic. Autorhythmic means that it's going to keep going zzz, 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 on its own without any input from anything. The autonomic nervous system can change the frequency, how fast it's sending out its signals. What would parasympathetic do to the sinoatrial node? Would it speed it up or slow it down?
Slow it down.
Slow it down.
Slow it down. Whereas, sympathetic would speed it up. In fact, if you, like the sinoatrial node has a kind of intrinsic speed of about 100 beats per minute. And most people have a lower heart rate at rest, and that's because you're getting parasympathetic innervation coming down to slow it down. What nerve is the one that's carrying the parasympathetic innervation to keep the heart going a little slower?
Vagus nerve.
Exactly, the vagus nerve. If you cut people's vagus nerve, their heart will actually speed up because it's no longer getting that message, that parasympathetic message to slow it down. So when that sinoatrial node fires off, the atria, which are all electrically connected to that and to each other, are going to all kind of contract together. So this is going to basically initiate atrial contraction. The official word for contraction when we're talking about heart is systole. So atrial systole means the atria are contracting. A little later, we're going to talk about ventricular systole, which means the ventricles are contracting. We should also mention the relaxed and refilling is called diastole. So you should know those terms. Diastole means relaxed and refilling. Systole means contracting. So when the sinoatrial node goes off, it initiates atrial contraction because that electrical excitation spreads all across the atria, but it doesn't automatically go to the ventricles because of this electrical excitation from the fibrous skeleton of the heart that we had been talking about just a few moments ago. So we're going to need a special little pathway, electrically conducting pathway to send the message down to the ventricles. So there's another little node, which is going to be called the AV node. This is the atrioventricular node. Ventricular. It gets its name because it's right near that boundary of the atrium and the ventricle. This is what is going to ultimately initiate ventricular systole. Meaning once it fires off, it's going to send electrical excitation that's going to go all over and cause the ventricles to get excited and contract. There is a little, what we call the internodal pathway that we need to add in here. Maybe let me maybe do green. So let's talk about this. Basically, when the SA node goes off, that's kind of like the beginning of your heartbeat. Then there's a little bit of a delay because you don't want the ventricles squeezing right away because you want the blood to, when the atria contract, you want the blood to get pushed down into the ventricles. Again, after about 1/10 to 2 seconds of a delay, 2/10 of a second delay, then we initiate ventricular contraction by having the AV node fire off. Even though the ventricle muscle is all connected by gap junctions and would all co-excite itself, in order to make sure that the electrical excitation gets spread everywhere really quick, there are specialized cardiac muscle cells that actually act to send the electrical excitation through really fast. So these are these cells. We have these Purkinje fibers. We have this main thing called the bundle of His, which kind of goes in between the two ventricles. It's supposed to be a snake going hiss. It then separates into what we call the bundle branches. Right and left bundle branches. And then just continuing up into becoming these kind of Purkinje fibers. So Purkinje fibers are basically as it goes on. So basically you have the AV node. In fact, let me go. I actually found a nice little PowerPoint, which I'm going to show you to make my life easier here. I updated on, I remember, if you remember the module where I had Marib PowerPoints, I've updated it to include all of the cardiovascular stuff, the vessels, the blood, as well as this kind of thing. So here you can see a nice little picture of, here's the SA node that's starting the whole thing. When it fires off, that's when the atria contract. Then there is this internodal pathway after about 0.1 to 0.2 seconds. It then fires off, and then we have, again, the bundle of His, the bundle branches, the Purkinje fibers that continue the signal. So I can like do a little, it's like, so sinoatrial node goes off after about 0.1 to 0.2 second delay. It then fires off the AV node, which is going to then trigger the bundle of His and the bundle branches and all this and the Purkinje fibers, which are then going to cause the ventricles contract and cause ventricular systole. So that is that. Okay. So any heart questions? Like how do I, okay, so let's continue on then. We're gonna now go to blood vessels. And let me look at the time. Hold on a sec here. No. All right, I'm going to continue. Oh, question?
Yes. Is viscera pericardium is the same as epicardium? Is it as another name for pericardium?
Say that one more time. I didn't hear you, Elsa. Say that one more
Okay.
time.
Is epicardium is another name for pericardium?
It's the same as the visceral pericardium. So the epicardium is another word for visceral pericardium, the layer that's against the heart itself. There are other layers of the pericardium. There's the parietal pericardium and fibrous pericardium that make up that sac, the other side of the serous membrane. But yeah, the epicardium.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Let me think. Since we're at the heart, let's continue with the gross anatomy. We'll get into the microscopic anatomy of the blood vessels, but let's start with the gross anatomy because it's kind of fun. Okay, it's very fun. So here's the heart. We're going to start with the arteries, the things that are leaving the heart. And you've got the aorta leaving the heart here. And it's all the aorta. You know, we can talk about the different regions. There's the ascending aorta, the aortic arch, the descending aorta, the thoracic aorta, where it's in your chest region, the abdominal aorta, where it's in your abdominal region. You know, so yes, there are different names, but you can kind of figure it out. You know, abdominal aorta is aorta that's located in your abdominal region. Thoracic aorta is a section of the aorta that's in your thoracic region. Now we need to put our person in here. It's like doing A-OK here. Maybe not. What? All right. So there are three main vessels coming off of the aorta that supply the upper body. We're going to follow the other stuff going to the lower body in a few moments, but let's start with the main arteries that supply the upper body. One of the things that's a little annoying is it's asymmetrical. So you're going to have to remember that the right side of the body and the left side of the body gets supplied a little differently right off of the aorta. So there are three main vessels coming off of the aorta. So first thing you're going to notice is, so this is the right side here. This is the left side. You're going to notice there's an asymmetry. So let us look at that in more detail now. So this thing that's coming off, this first big vessel that is coming off of the heart here, this is called the brachiocephalic trunk. Trunk. From its name, brachio. What is brachium?
Arm.
Arm. And cephalic is head. So it's supplying the arm and the head. Brachiocephalic trunk is the thing that's going off to the arm and the head. And it branches. It has one branch that is going to go towards the arm. That is called the subclavian artery, the right subclavian artery here. I should say right there. Subclavian means under the clavicle. So you can kind of imagine it's going right under the clavicle. You know, then it gets different names depending as you move along. When it's under your arm, it's going to be the axillary artery. Once it gets to your arm, what's it going to be called?
To your arm?
And what are we going to call a major artery going into your arm?
Brachial artery.
Exactly. This is going to be my brachial artery. Ah! Excuse me. So I'm trying to. So basically, brachiocephalic trunk comes up. It has one branch that goes off towards the arm. It starts with the subclavian, which is under the clavicle. When it gets to the place where your arm meets the body, it's now the axillary artery under your arm. Once you get into the arm proper, it's now called the brachial artery, but it's all the same basic pipe. On the left side, you have just its own independent thing going off. So on the left side, we have the left subclavian artery that just comes directly off the aorta. So if you're on the right side, you have to go up the brachiocephalic trunk and then you get to the right subclavian. Whereas if you're on the left side, it's just a direct connection to the aortic arch there. And it's going to also have, after that, it's all symmetrical. Left subclavian goes to the left axillary, goes to the left brachial. Meanwhile, we also have the arteries going up into the head. So the arteries that are going up into the head are called the carotid. And these are called the right and left common carotid arteries. So those are the ones that are heading up into the head. Again, notice the asymmetry. The left common carotid comes straight off of the, if I can use the little, you can see the left common carotid is coming straight off of the aortic arch here, whereas the right common carotid is branching off of the brachiocephalic trunk. But then there are just two pipes going up into your head. There is then a branching again. The branch that stays more into the external, the parts of your face become the external carotid. The part that goes up into your brain is the internal carotid. I can write that. So the internal carotid artery, we have met it before. What path does it take to actually get into your brain? How does the internal carotid artery get into your brain?
Carotid canal.
It's going to go up through that little carotid canal and up into your brain. Exactly. Another artery that comes off of the subclavian that we actually have met are the little vertebral arteries. If you remember, the vertebral arteries were the ones that then go up through those little foramina in the transverse processes of the cervical vertebrae, and ultimately are going to go up into the brain through the foramen magnum. We'll look at that in more detail when we look at the circulation in the brain and the circle of Willis and all that. But these are another artery that goes to serve the brain. The vertebral artery and the internal carotid artery both go into the brain. And again, we'll meet them a little later as well. Let's continue here. So we had the brachial artery. Maybe I'll start anew. All right, so we saw that the left subclavian, and this is going to be mirrored on the other side as well. The right subclavian goes into the right axillary, and then we go into basically the brachial artery. The brachial artery, you can actually feel, it's kind of medial. If you like go kind of on the lower part of your upper arm, kind of above your elbow, and kind of in medial, more towards the middle, and you kind of push in there, you can feel it thumping in there. The pulse of the brachial artery is pretty easy to find. It's a useful one to know. It's what you actually use when you're taking blood pressure. You're actually putting the stethoscope on that brachial artery and listening to different sounds as it gets kind of compressed by the blood pressure cuff. Brachial artery is also a good pressure point to know. If somebody accidentally slices off all their fingers in a bandsaw accident and you just see all of these blood squirting out of all their fingers, just by putting pressure on that brachial artery, you can stop the majority of the blood flow down into their kind of forearm there. So it's a useful thing to be able to feel and know where that brachial artery is. Once it gets to the forearm, it separates. The part that goes towards the thumb is the radial artery. The part that goes down to the pinky side is going to be the ulnar artery. My God, I'm not sure why I've got some technical difficulties going on here. Ulnar artery. And then when you get to the hand, it makes this kind of loop. It's called the palmar arch. And there's a deep and a more superficial, you can just think of it as a palmar arch. And then the digital arteries come off of those, going to your fingers. So as we're going through all this, remember I mentioned last time, I am very fond of having questions on the exam that have some personified blood drop. So, you know, little Benji the blood drop is here. And Benji the blood drop is currently in the left ventricle and wants to deliver blood to your thumb. How does he do it? What is the path he can take? You know, little Benji blood drop, where is he going to go? What's he going to see as he goes from the left ventricle to get to the thumb?
The brachial artery, the radial artery.
Before that even, so he's in the left atrium right now. Where's the very next thing he's going to have to go to?
Through the aorta.
He's going to have to go out the aorta. And even before he gets to the aorta, what valve is he going to see?
Aortic valve.
The aortic, a little more?
The left subclavian.
No. So we haven't even left the ventricle yet. What's the valve that you have to pass through to get into the aorta?
Semilunar valve.
The semilunar valve. So first Benji is gonna go past the aortic semilunar valve into the aorta, ascending aorta and the arch. Then what happens next?
Goes off into the right subclavian or the left subclavian.
And then it's the left subclavian, then into the brachial. Then it doesn't matter which of these, radial or ulnar, he takes because we have this anastomosis. I should give you that word. Anastomosis. This is when there is more than one path for the blood to take to get to where it's going. So anastomosis, they're more common in the veins, and the veins, there's usually many, many, many different paths you can take to get from point A to point P. But in this case, we also have an anastomosis where you can get to like the thumb either by going down the radial artery and going around the arch and going down the digital artery, or you can go down the ulnar artery and go down the arch the other way and come out. So there's two different ways to get to the thumb. There's no right answer for Benji to get to the thumb here. What if Benji had just returned to the heart? Benji had just delivered blood and just ended up at the heart, but he wants to pick up oxygen and deliver oxygen to the thumb. What's he gonna have to do?
He's going to have to go through the lungs.
Exactly. So where did he arrive? If he's just come back to the heart after being in the body, where does he come back into?
The superior vena cava.
Exactly. So he's going to be coming in through the vena cava and then into where?
Tricuspid.
Right atrium.
The right atrium. Yeah, and then we heard through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle, and then where?
Into the pulmonary valve.
Yes, that's that pulmonary, which kind of valve?
Pulmonary valve.
What's its full name?
Got
Anybody else? What's the name of the valve?
The
That-
semilunar valve, the pulmonary semilunar valve.
Pulmonary semilunar valve. Then what's the big pipe you go out when you pop out the top here?
aorta.
Oh, no, not going to the lungs.
Pulmonary trunk.
That's the pulmonary trunk. And then we're going to go through the pulmonary arteries, which are going to go to the lungs, pick up our oxygen. And then what do we do coming back from the lungs?
Going through pulmonary vein into left ventricle.
Uh-huh. Pulmonary vein into the left, no, into the left what?
Atrium.
Atrium.
Yeah, pulmonary vein into the left atrium, and then through the bicuspid valve into the left ventricle. And then we could follow him. Then from the left ventricle out the aortic semilunar valve and the aorta, and then off the subclavian down the brachial artery and all that. So when you are studying this stuff, think like that. Think about little Benji the blood drop. Or again, you can name it whatever you want. It could be, I don't know, Dorothy the drop of blood, or whatever. I'm looking if anybody in the class hasn't. No, so that is the top. For the arteries on the top part of the body, those are the ones you need to know. Now let's look at the arteries on the lower part of the body. So we have, again, the stuff we just been talking about. But now we're going to look at what happens once you get into the abdominal cavity. There are lots and lots of other vessels that we're not responsible for, but these are the ones that you're responsible for. As soon as you get on the other side of the diaphragm into the abdominal cavity, you get this area we call the celiac trunk. So it's 3 arteries that are coming off kind of all together. So one is going to be the splenic artery. Maybe I should say equals. Splenic artery, which is going to go where?
To the spleen.
To the spleen, yeah. There's going to be what we call the left gastric artery, which is going to be going to supply the stomach. And there's going to be the common hepatic artery, which is going to be going off towards the liver. So kind of splenic, again, is going to be going to the spleen. Your spleen is just kind of sitting up here in the upper left-hand corner of your abdominal cavity here. Left gastric is going to go, your stomach is in here. right? Your stomach. Left gastric is going to supply the stomach. And your liver is over here. So the common hepatic is going over to supply hepatic, meaning having to do with the liver. You might wonder, like, well, if there's a left gastric, where's the right gastric? There is a right gastric, and it actually comes off of the common hepatic, kind of comes over and comes back this way. So you don't need to know it, though. You should know the celiac trunk, the first major kind of spigots coming off of the descending abdominal aorta there. Again, one big branch going to the spleen, one to the stomach, one heading off towards the liver, although it does have a little side branch coming back to the stomach. So celiac trunk. I'm going to erase my organs here to give myself more space. Oh, but I want to leave. The two main arteries that are supplying all of your digestive organs in general are not paired. So you're noticing where most things we're going to talk about in terms of the blood vessels are symmetrical. There's going to be a right and a left brachial artery, a right and a left ulnar and radial artery. But there's only one splenic artery, one common hepatic artery. These mesenteric arteries that supply the digestive organs are also unpaired. So there's going to be one big one. Let me use a fatter. So these are going to be my superior and inferior mesenteric arteries. Good God. Again, they are not paired. Maybe I should write that. And again, they are going to go and supply all your intestines and everything. We will come back to them. Other arteries that come off of here, the ones we're going to be looking at in a lot of detail when we get to the urinary system. You've got the renal arteries coming off here. Where are the renal arteries going to go?
The kidney.
To the kidney. So, and we're going to see that the renal arteries are carrying a lot of your blood. About up to a quarter of your blood flow is actually spewing out through the renal arteries to go to the kidneys to get processed. So we're going to definitely be coming back to the renal arteries and looking at what happens to all the blood that's going to the kidneys when we get to the urinary system. Once you get to this level, this is kind of where your hip bones are. So these two main branches that come off at the bottom of the descending aorta where it splits, these are called the common iliac arteries. See, I am so not sure why my thing stops typing down there. Oh, let me type that in again, sorry. Common iliac. Good God. And then the common iliac artery then splits one part that stays more superficial and is going to go down the front of your leg. Another part that actually is going to go deep into the structures that are deeper in the pelvis there. This is going to then branch in. So this is called the external iliac, is this one that stays more outside. The internal iliac is going to be this inside one here. And the external iliac, then as soon as it's down in your thigh, what do you think we call it?
Femoral.
Exactly, the femoral. So if I can probably, let me see if this works. Hold on a sec here. So here is and I left a message with these guys. I have not heard back yet about getting you all free things yet. So I am on it still, but it hasn't happened yet. All right, so again, here we have the heart going. It might make sense to add in the body here. Again, here coming off the aorta, you can see there's that brachiocephalic trunk, which is going off to the right side of the body. And that the brachiocephalic trunk has the common carotid going up, and it has the subclavian coming off it. Coming off the subclavian is also that little vertebral artery, which is going to be going up into the brain. And again, that vertebral artery you can see is going up through the little foramina in the transverse processes of the cervical vertebrae. So this should all look pretty familiar. You know, later on, if we look underneath here, you can see those vertebral arteries end up entering into the skull through the foramen magnum, whereas the internal carotid goes up into that little carotid canal, up into the bottom of the skull there to supply the brain. Meanwhile, on the right side, you just have the common carotid, left common carotid coming straight off of the aorta here, and the left subclavian coming straight off of there. Left subclavian turns into the axillary and turns into the brachial. Brachial then goes into the, whoops, no, I don't mean the bone. We have the radial artery going to the thumb, the ulnar artery going to the pinky. I think I need to add in another layer of arteries. Bing! So now we've got like our little palmar arch, which is going across, connecting them up. No, come on. Then let's add in another layer. We should get we start getting the digital arteries coming off. So we have the arch, the digital artery. So you can get, this is what we were talking about. If we go look at below, now let me turn off some of these layers. Right here, this is supposed to be that this celiac trunk. So this is right below your diaphragm, getting into the abdominal cavity. This is the thing that is taking off to go to the spleen, to the liver, to the stomach. If I add in another layer here, we should see that happening. There we go. There we have the splenic artery going towards the spleen. We have, this is the left gastric going up to the stomach, the common hepatic coming off towards the liver. Below that, here is that superior mesenteric artery, which is going to your digestive organs. Again, there's another one below that, that is the inferior mesenteric artery, which is also going to digestive organs. Wonder if there you can see those a little better. Again, the superior celiac trunk, superior mesenteric, inferior mesenteric, both coming straight off of the aorta. Here we have the renal arteries coming off of the aorta, going to the right and left kidneys. And then these ones, hold on. These little guys are the gonadal arteries. In a guy, they're going down to the testes. In a woman, they're going down to the ovaries. I think I put those on your list as well. If you see an artery leaving off of the aorta here, a little below the renal arteries, heading down to the right, the genital area, then you know they're the gonadal arteries. So this was supposed to be in the testes if this was a guy. Obviously, this model is a guy. All right, so then let me turn those off. This split here at the bottom of the descending aorta, this is where we get those common iliac arteries. Again, the common iliac arteries become an external iliac, which is going to continue down to become the femoral artery going down the front of your leg. And then this little branch that stays more inside here, which is going to be the internal iliac, which is going and supplying the deeper structures in your pelvis. So that makes sense? So let's take a break. And we'll finish up the vessels in a little bit. Let's, it's 3:15. Let's say at 3:45, we're gonna come back and finish the arteries and do the veins. So I will leave you with the thumping heart, the telltale heart. Boom, boom, boom. So exam 3, exam 2. And let me double check. It says, so April 21st. So it will still just go through the cardiovascular system. We will have, we will be starting lymphatic, maybe endocrine before it comes, but we will not have that on this exam. This will be basically nervous system and cardiovascular system. So, and that makes me feel a little less stressed right now in terms of moving through the material. So, last we left our circulation. We were at the heart. We followed it down. Let's put the body here. So we saw that there was a celiac trunk right as you enter the abdominal cavity. There was the superior and inferior mesenteric arteries that were supplying the digestive organs. There was the renal arteries going into the kidneys, the gonadal arteries going down to your gonads. Then we will continue following it down. Then we saw that we split into the common iliac arteries. The external iliac continued to be the femoral artery. And then there was also a branch that kind of stayed more inside. That was the internal iliac. So to end our arteries, we're just going to look at what happens as you go down the leg. So the main thing coming down the front was the femoral artery. The femoral artery ends up kind of moving behind the knee. So it comes down, but then it kind of ends up behind. It becomes, what are we going to call something that's behind the knee?
Popliteal?
Exactly. Becomes the popliteal artery. And then it continues down and is just like the posterior tibial artery. There is a thing that comes to the front that becomes the anterior tibial as well. And there's another one that comes off of the side of the posterior tibial that goes to the lateral part of the leg, which is going to be the fibular artery. So this will be prettier if I just actually go back to the, let me go pull up our, oop, hold on, doo-doo-doo. Oh, I see what I got to do. So if we come in here and here was the leg, and let's put the bones in here. So here you can see the femoral artery. Let's just kind of clear all of these. So coming off of here is the common iliac, the external iliac becoming the femoral artery. And then here you see like, oh my God, the femoral artery is actually going down behind the kneecap. So here behind the kneecap, and kind of keeping you oriented, this is the popliteal artery. Whoop. My mousing skills could be better here. There. Popliteal artery going behind the knee. Then we see that it just continues down. The popliteal artery continues down along the back of the tibia and is the posterior tibial artery. We can also see that it has another branch that's going here in between the fibula and tibia and ends up on the front of the leg here. That's going to be the anterior tibial artery. So that you can see it coming from that after the popliteal, there's that branch that zips to the front anterior part of the leg to become the anterior tibial. And again, if we kind of go back to the posterior tibial here, you can see this little branch that goes lateral. That's the fibular artery. And fibular artery, and it's not going to matter anymore because we're not using the models that have in the lab, but it used to be called the peroneal artery. Like in some of our old model keys, they actually label the fibular artery as the peroneal artery. So if you ever see that word, it's just the same thing. It's a synonym. But, you know, and then when you get down to the foot, it's the same basic idea. You're going to have like a dorsal arch and a plantar arch and digital arteries. Yeah, I think there's like the plantar, there's the plantar arch. Let's, if we add in another layer, there we go. Wow. Are they kind of, they're not really labeling it in here, but basically it's similar to your hands. I wonder if there's another layer there. Oh, this one actually, I don't think you have it officially in your, oh, there's, no, that's not it. So this dorsal pedis arch is actually something that is used clinically to see if you have adequate blood flow out to the extremities of your leg. So they'll actually, if you're in a clinical exam, sometimes they'll try to feel this and see how strong it is to see if you have kind of adequate pressure still coming down here. So I don't think it's on your list, but the dorsal pedis artery actually does come up in a clinical setting. So that is the arteries you need to know. The other arteries that, you know, we talked about would be this one, right? Pulmonary artery. What is, in fact, let me turn off the bones because you can see it better. Notice what color are the pulmonary arteries?
Blue.
They are blue because they are, remember, so these are the things that are coming off the pulmonary trunk. Let me not make you seasick here. So, okay, here is, let me get, come on, heart. So basically the pulmonary trunk is coming out the front here. There's the pulmonary trunk. And then the pulmonary arteries are blue because they are carrying deoxygenated blood to the lungs. So, you know, they're like the lung. If we fade the lungs, can we, I don't know if we can actually make it see the pulmonary. Oh, there you can see the pulmonary arteries basically go into the lung tissue here to deliver the oxygen and to deliver the blood, which then can pick up oxygen and will come back in the pulmonary veins. But if you see some picture or some model, just because something is bright red or bright blue doesn't tell you it's an artery or a vein. If you're looking at the pulmonary arteries are blue. So just kind of keep that in mind. So speaking of veins, let's do the veins. So the veins are a little more symmetrical up at the top. You know, we've already talked about the superior vena cava, which is draining the upper part of the body, and the inferior vena cava, which is draining the lower part of the body. And they're both coming into the right atrium. Instead of having that asymmetry like we had with coming off of the aorta, the right and left upper body both have a brachiocephalic vein. So a brachiocephalic meaning goes and then branches to go up to the head and go to the arm. So a right brachiocephalic vein and a left brachiocephalic vein. And similar to the arteries. You know, the one that goes to the arm is going to have an axillary, and then, but we're going to see it gets weirder once you go into the arm. I'll get into the arm. I'll write it down a little later. The jugular veins are the ones that return the blood from the brain and the face. Again, there's this asymmetry between carotid arteries serve the head, jugular veins drain. And instead of having a common jugular, you actually have the internal and external both kind of just dropping in. The vertebral vein also drops in here. I bet you if we add in another layer, actually, I don't even see it here. Ooh, this is getting messy. So I'm going to go back to my again, we have the heart. Then we have our superior vena cava. And again, that's going to branch into the right and left brachiocephalic veins. And then one is going to the arm. We have this axillary vein. Then we have the jugular, internal and external jugular veins coming down. A lot of times people get questions wrong because they forget that, you know, carotid is only about arteries. Jugular is the vein. So yeah, try to make sure you keep that straight. Jugular vein is coming back. Carotid is going up. Veins are way lower pressure. When the heart is pumping the blood out the aorta, it's under a lot of pressure, like up to 100 something millimeters of mercury. It's got a lot of pressure to keep the blood flowing. By the time you're on the other side of a capillary bed, the blood pressure is down to like 20 millimeters of mercury. It's barely limping along. By the time you get back to the vena cava, you actually have pretty much zero blood pressure left. We're going to talk about the different things that actually make sure the blood actually keeps flowing and makes it back to the heart. But in general, the pressure is very low. And in general, there are a lot of anastomoses, many alternate paths that the blood can take in the veins to get from point A to point B. So like in the arm is going to be way more complicated. Like even though let's see. Okay, I've got Jamba muted there. We've got lots. We're going to have a brachial vein and a radial and a ulnar vein, but those aren't even the ones. When you look at your arm and you see those blue lines, those aren't ones that, they're other ones. They're the cephalic, the basilic vein. The ones that they stick a needle in to draw blood, that's the median cubital vein. So let's take a look at those other more superficial veins, the veins that are closer to the skin in the arm. So this is stinky. Let's do that again. So we had the vein kind of coming in. There was the subclavian vein, axillary vein. And now, like when you look in your books, in fact, you're going to see the same arm and you'll see different veins. And you're wondering, what's up? It's going to be the difference between superficial and deeper veins. So let's start with superficial veins. So these are the veins that are closer to the skin. These are the ones that you can kind of see. They look blue, even though reality, they're not really blue, but they look blue. Hold on, I need to add some power in here. Hold on 1 second. And also make sure I've got this thing going here. All right. So there's going to be a superficial vein that kind of goes along more laterally. This is called the cephalic vein. So you might think like, what's up? It's cephalic. Isn't cephalic the head? Why is something going down your arm called cephalic vein? So I looked it up once and it turns out it's like somebody spazzed at some point. Like the original person who named it, I think was like I think the original name was like in Arabic. And when somebody was trying to kind of look at these old anatomy texts and it sounded kind of like cephalic, even though the word that it actually made sense in the language it was supposed to be in, but the person who ended up writing it into some new textbook wrote it as cephalic. And at this point, it's just called the cephalic vein, even though it has nothing to do with the head. So you just have to be all right with that. Another one that's staying more medial, it's called the basilic vein. Basilic, that one makes more sense. Basilic means royal. You know, in blue, you've heard of blue blood. Blue blood is somebody who is royal, like kind of, the higher social strata. And it's because, if you were really rich or part of the aristocracy, you didn't have to work. And you would have very pale, translucent skin because you were just sitting in your little drawing room all day doing whatever. And the people who had to work were out in the fields getting tan and you couldn't see their blood vessels through their skin. So at least in this kind of European context, blue blood meant like aristocratic or royal because you could see your veins easily because you weren't tanned at all because you didn't have to work. So basilic. There is a connector that goes between them that's in your antecubital area, like in front of your elbow here. This is called the median cubital vein. This one you do need to know about as you go forward because that's the main one they stick a needle in to draw blood for a blood draw. Right, and like I was saying, the veins have very low pressure. So if you stick a needle inside a vein, you're not in danger of having this big geyser splooshing out of the hole. So you can stick the needle in and the blood will slowly seep up into your little thing that you're trying to catch it in or whatever. Right, if you stuck a hole in an artery, it would be bad because there's a lot of pressure there. So median cubital vein is it's the one you see. If you look if you look in your elbow, you'll see this thing kind of angling across. And that's where they stick the needle. Meanwhile, there are deeper veins as well. Maybe I'll draw them in black, or I don't know. So coming off of here, there are also deeper veins. Maybe I should have drawn the body in yellow. So these are going to be the deeper veins. There's going to be a brachial vein. You know, and it's also going to split into a radial and ulnar vein. And that being said, even though I've kind of drawn it kind of pretty here as, oh, here are these main veins going, there are lots of anastomoses, you know. Anastomoses up the wazoo, whatever you'd say. So like, again, if we kind of go back, you know, it's like, this is kind of showing, here's the subclavian vein coming off here, or this is axillary, and then into the subclavian. No, this is subclavian. Should be right here. There. Subclavian vein is the one that comes off of the brachiocephalic going towards the arm. Axillary vein, the one that goes into your underarm. But then we're going to have some that just stay more superficial. So here's this, here's the cephalic vein, which is kind of staying more lateral and superficial on your arm. Here's going to be the basilic vein, which is also superficial, staying more medial. Yeah, I should. Is this, in fact, was this the dude? Let's add in some more veins now. Here, this one here is supposed to be, I think this is supposed to be the brachial vein, probably. I am not sure why it's not clicking. I'll get to it. Oh, here's, so this. There's a little median cubital vein. That's that little one that's kind of going back and goes from the basilic over to the cephalic. And this was a cephalic vein here. This was the, I wonder if I can hit, if I hit shift. So basilic, oh, maybe control. Yeah, basilic, cephalic, and then this little, no, not that doohickey. That little doohickey is the median cubital vein there. Meanwhile, yeah, so there's this deep brachial vein right here. So this one, let me turn these off now. So here, this is that one that's going to be deep. Hold on. Oh my God. Yeah, I get lots of random stupid calls too. All right, so we've got this brachial deep one, like I said, and then that is going to, as you get here, take a look. You can see it's not clean. It's really messy. These are the anastomoses I was talking about. You know, all of these veins have all these interconnections with each other. So there are the main veins, you can see the basilic and the cephalic and the median cubital, but there's also a whole lot of little shortcuts and things on all of these as well. When you get down, let me turn this off now, a few layers. When you are looking at the drainage of the digestive organs, you don't see it. So remember how we had the superior and inferior mesenteric artery going to the digestive organs, and we saw the things off the celiac trunk, the left gastric artery and the splenic artery. We had all these. There are no mesenteric veins that are coming into the vena cava here. There are gonna be mesenteric veins, but they're not actually gonna be coming here. We're gonna see it's gonna be this hepatic portal system in a few moments. The only things that we're actually gonna see come in here, we're gonna have the ones coming from the kidney. So the renal veins, which are going to be draining the kidneys. And again, we'll look at those in more detail when we do the urinary system. And then there is the veins that are draining the liver. So there's this hepatic vein coming in from the liver. So we are going to, so remember that there's a hepatic vein which drains from the liver to the vena cava. And we'll come back to that in a few moments. Once you get to the bottom of the vena cava, it's going to do the same kind of thing we saw with the arteries. There's going to be a common iliac vein. There's going to be a deeper one, this internal iliac vein for the deeper structures, an external iliac vein going more externally, going down the femoral vein. I shouldn't say get down, but the blood's coming up, but the blood's coming up along the femoral vein on the front here, which is then going to go kind of do a similar kind of deal that we saw. We're going to have the popliteal vein. Let me put the bones back on so you can see it. So same kind of idea that we saw with the arteries, external or common iliac vein, external iliac vein, femoral vein, then going to the popliteal vein, going down to the posterior tibial vein. If you, though, wanted, let's say you had Betsy the blood drop and she was down in your foot and she wants to get back to the heart. Little Betsy the blood drop, if she's in the foot, she could come up the posterior tibial and then through the popliteal vein and then to the femoral vein and up to the external iliac vein. Or coming off of the external iliac vein, there is this big shortcut. If you look, it's going all the way from the iliac vein here, all the way down to the foot. This is called the great saphenous vein. I should probably draw that as a word so you know what it is. So the basic idea here, here is the body, here's the legs and the feet. And we had the vena cava. It's split into a right and left iliac, common iliac. Internal iliac goes in, external iliac stays more superficial. Femoral vein went behind popliteal vein, posterior tibial vein. Or you can take one thing that's the great saphenous vein. So again, like if Betsy blood drop is in your foot and she's trying to get back to the heart, she could just hop on the great saphenous vein and she'll be back up at the, external iliac vein. She doesn't have to go up through the, this would be like the tibial and popliteal and femoral. This one is often harvested like when someone's going to get a coronary bypass surgery. Like if your coronary arteries are clogged up, which is going to be bad, it means your cardiac muscle is not getting as much blood as it needs. And they do this surgery where they graft on other vessels to bypass the coronary artery blockage. So you have the full blood flow going back. They'll take this great saphenous vein, which again it's nice to have it, but you don't need it. There's all those anastomoses, lots of other ways for the blood to get back where it needs to. So they'll harvest this out of your own body. They'll take it out. And then you've got this big long snake of blood vessel. Again, it's the whole length of your leg. And then they can snip it and they can sew it in to bypass the different blockages in your circulation supplying your heart. So the great saphenous vein. The last part I want to add in here is the idea of a hepatic portal system. So if you remember, we had like the superior and inferior mesenteric arteries, etc. Supply digestive supply digestive viscera. But the blood that's going off to the digestive organs is not just about keeping the tissue alive. A big part, why do you send blood to your small intestine? What's a big part of the job of sending blood to the intestines?
They take waste away.
Not really. No, the waste is actually coming out your butt, right? That's the food that you're not digesting, you kind of poop out. What is the stuff that
To get the nutrients?
exactly? It's to absorb the nutrients. It's getting the good stuff. And you bring it into your bloodstream. So you send the blood to the digestive organs like your small intestine, and you absorb the stuff that you want, but you process it first. You don't just dump it right into circulation. What happens is it needs to go to the liver first, and the liver can transform things, it can detoxify things, it can store excess things. So the blood that comes to the digestive viscera drains. So the digestive viscera veins all drain into, so there are a variety of named veins you don't need to know. They usually are called mesenteric this or that. But what you do need to know is they all ultimately drain into this big vein called the hepatic portal vein. And that hepatic portal vein then drains into a second capillary bed in the liver. And then after you are done with that, that second capillary bed drains into the hepatic vein. And now we're back in the normal circulation. So again, if you were thinking about it, you basically have kind of the mesenteric arteries coming in to a system of capillaries that are in the digestive viscera. But then those drain into this hepatic portal vein, which goes into a second capillary bed in the liver. And that is then to the vena cava. So capillary bed 1, capillary bed 2. So when you're looking on the vena cava, you know, for where is the entrance of all the draining of all of your blood vessels from your digestive organs, they don't enter directly in the vena cava. The only thing you can see are where the hepatic veins, the draining of the liver comes in here. So there's like this hepatic vein. So let me look on here. So this thing right here, I'm going to clear all this stuff. This thing here, this is the hepatic portal vein. I'm kind of trying to illustrate it here. It's kind of just floating in space. Basically, what would be happening is this side here that I'm kind of moving the mouse around in, that is where all of the capillaries from your intestines and stomach and stuff are draining into, coming into here. This pink thing I just drew here is the hepatic portal vein, and then it goes into the liver. And so you see it's not going back to the vena cava, it's going into a second capillary bed here. And then this thing here is the hepatic vein. So in between these two things is going to be the second capillary bed where the nutrients are being processed that are being absorbed from the blood. So if that makes sense. Again, if we add in, it's probably, again, I just, you can see the liver is right there. The liver is, the hepatic portal vein is draining into the liver. Maybe we can fade that out. Yeah, you can see the hepatic portal system is basically feeding into the liver. Liver has a second bed, and then the veins from the liver then ultimately drain into the vena cava there. Let's see. Oh, I know what I want to do. No, so this, well, actually we'll get here. This is kind of showing differences between artery and veins. This is actually going to be useful as well. The basic idea, what time is it? Yeah, let me spend a few moments talking about the differences of artery and veins, and then we're going to call it an afternoon or an evening or whatever it is. And so both of them have the same basic structure, but then there are differences in the details. So let's first talk about how they're common, how they're similar. So arteries and veins, they're basically conduits, tubes that are carrying blood. We can start with the innermost part. The lining. So the lining is always going to be called, it's always going to be this endothelium. We also call it the tunica intima. So when you're reading about blood vessels or research on this or that in terms of vessels, sometimes they'll call it intima. Sometimes they'll call it endothelium. It's the same thing. It's just the simple squamous epithelium that lines all blood vessels and capillaries, as well as lining the inside of the heart. So endothelium, tunica intima. The main wall of the, I don't know what it's called tunica media. That's kind of the main wall. And that is going to basically be smooth muscle and elastic tissue. Smooth muscle, you know what it looks like under the microscope. Again, it's kind of making me sad. We're not going to be seeing this in real life, but we'll see pictures of it. Elastic fibers. If you remember elastic fibers from like the elastic cartilage, the elastic fibers tend to dye this kind of black purple color. So if you're looking at a vessel under the microscope and you see the elastic fibers, they tend to dye kind of this dark purple. And they tend to be kind of wiggly as well, actually, because something that's elastic, if it's not under tension, it tends to collapse in and get a little kind of wiggly wrinkle look. So that's what I'm kind of trying to draw here is the elastic fibers, which you might or might not see in different proportions, depending on what artery or vein you're looking at. Then the outermost part, there are a couple of names we can use for that. We can call it the tunica externa. We can also just call it the adventitia. You should probably know that word, adventitia. In general, adventitia is just dense connective tissue. So dense fibrous connective tissue. When we're looking at the organs in your body, usually there's kind of two options. Either they're covered in a serous membrane, like the lungs or most of the intestines or the heart, where you have that double layer so things get slippy and slidey with the surrounding structures. Or the other option is they've got dense fibrous connective tissue kind of as a kind of leathery coating on the outside. That's called adventitia. Like when we get to the digestive system and we talk about the esophagus is going to be one of the only parts or few parts of the digestive tract that are not wrapped around in the peritoneum and the serous membrane. And we'll say, oh, its outer coating is adventitia. Just means dense connective tissue, outer part of the thing. So dense fibrous CT. This is kind of a cool thing. You know, in general, you know, obviously these cells need their own oxygen and nutrients. If it's a smaller blood vessel, you could just have diffusion of oxygen and nutrients from the blood that's actually going through the blood vessel, supply the blood vessel itself. But if it's a big artery, like, you know, a lot of the arteries, the brachial artery, the ones we're talking about, they're big hoses. They're too wide to be letting just pure diffusion supply. So you actually have blood vessels that come in and supply the actual blood vessel. So they call them the vasa vasorum. Vasa vasorum. It means the vessels of the vessels. So it's, yeah, it's always kind of seemed kind of cool that big blood vessels need their own blood vessels to supply and support their own kind of cellular activity. So that is the common thing between arteries and veins. And now in the next 5 minutes, we will talk about how they differ, arteries versus veins. So that was working together, common goal, have blood circulating in the body. But now, smackdown, arteries versus veins. So let's look at how they are differ from each other. Main thing is arteries are coming like right off the heart. The ventricles are squeezing really strong, big pressures. Ventricles are generating, again, even at rest, you know, most people like around 120 millimeters of mercury, higher blood pressure. If you're moving around much, much higher, you need to make sure that these arteries, one, don't just pop or balloon out, and that they can adjust their diameter even under that big pressure to, you know, regulate blood flow and regulate blood pressure and all that. So these need a lot of smooth muscle in their walls in order to be able to hold against the pressure. So these are going to have a thick tunica media. Because the veins are under very low pressure, like I said, typically at the end of a capillary bed, you're down to like 20 millimeters of mercury. It's very low. By the time you get back to the heart and the vena cava, it's usually down at 0. So very low pressure means they have very thin tunica medias. It also, because of this, when you look at them under the microscope or on the cadavers, these tend to stay open. They're kind of like rubber hoses. I will show you on some of the videos of cadavers, although we're obviously not going back to ever see them in class. Veins are much floppier. Like sometimes you don't even know it's a vein until you pick it up and kind of like, wait, is this a tube or is it a flat structure? Whereas an artery is like totally, oh, this is a rubber tube with a lumen. You know, remember, lumen is just the space inside. So this has a lumen as well, but obvious, if this is not with blood pressure opening it up, the lumen just collapses in on itself. They also look different under on the cadaver, because when you're just kind of looking at this, you basically see all the smooth muscle in the tunica media, and it looks kind of white. It looks kind of like a white rubber tube. When you look at a vein, even if the vein has, you know, is kind of filled, it's got all this blood inside and the walls are really small. So it tends to look darker. it looks darker. And if you kind of try cleaning things up, you're much more likely to rip through the wall and get into a bunch of dried blood inside because the wall is so thin. Whereas with the arteries, they're kind of just thick and rubbery. Other ways they're different, because the diameter, a larger diameter makes it easier for blood to flow at low pressure. Veins tend to be larger diameter. In general, if you have a smaller diameter, there's more resistance to flow. A larger diameter, less resistance to flow. So if we have really low pressure to start with, it's nice to have a larger diameter, so it makes it easier to have a flow at lower pressures. Of the arteries, so let's just finish up veins here. Whoop. So to keep blood flow at really low pressure, they have valves. So these little one-way valves. So the blood can move one way, but it can't get back. Yeah, maybe I will have to think about it if I have time. If you like take your arm and you kind of push down and you push towards your hand the wrong way that the blood's supposed to flow, you'll start seeing your veins pop out, and you'll see where the valves are stopping the blood from going, and everything will get all kind of swollen. It's kind of weird looking. If you push and pull up towards your heart the way the blood is supposed to go, you'll see all the veins flatten out and the blood is all moving up. So I was just kind of showing you that picture just a second ago. If you look here, the artery has thick walls, thick tunica media, lots of smooth muscle. The vein does not have much smooth muscle at all there, because it doesn't need that much strength to counteract the very low pressure. The vein also is a larger diameter. Veins tend to have larger diameters for the same kind of conditions in order to allow lower pressures to keep the flows going. And then valves, one-way valves. Here the blood can go one way, but it can't go back. Once it goes from here to here, it can't backtrack. Whereas arteries, you never have that. There's no issue. There's so much pressure, the blood has no trouble continuing flowing in the direction it's going. These valves work together with a few other things to make sure the blood keeps making it all the way back to the heart. So, like, here's my vein with my one-way valves. And it's in your body, and there's all these muscles all around. Here's like your skeletal muscles. So as you're kind of moving, these skeletal muscles are going to be pushing and relaxing. So these are going to massage the veins. And as that happens, they're going to kind of milk them. So let's say there's some blood right here and the muscle squishes, it's push. Now it's over here. Once the blood is further down the line, it can't go back anymore. And then they squish again and push. It's a little further down the line. So this kind of milking is one of the ways you're keeping the blood flowing one way back to the heart, even though the pressure is really low. So this is not smooth muscle. Right? We know there is smooth muscle in the wall of the blood vessel, but that is purely about changing diameter for different reasons. But it does not propel or drive the movement of blood. So it's the surrounding skeletal muscle that's doing this milking thing here. The other thing that will happen, we'll talk about in more detail, but we can kind of introduce here. So your lungs are here too, and here's the vena cava coming up. So the vena cava is returning to the heart. And the thoracic cavity, in order for breathing to happen, you're constantly having the pressure go up and down and up and down. The way breathing works, pulmonary ventilation, again, we're going to learn about that in more detail later, but it basically means the pressure is going up and down in your chest cavity as the diaphragm and other muscles contract and relax. That means it's another kind of pushing and pulling, pumping, massaging on this vena cava and on the veins here. So we call this the respiratory pump. The respiratory pump is just referring to the fact that just by breathing, you are basically massaging these major veins that are helping return the blood back to the heart, you know, using, again, the one-way valves to help things keep moving as well. So let's go back to arteries. Let's just say there are two main types. So most of the arteries, the tunica media is mainly smooth muscle. So just by its name, muscular artery, it means that the tunica media is smooth muscle, and it's kind of optimized to alter its diameter and hold it to, again, adjust blood flow, adjust pressure. Elastic arteries are very elastic in their tunica media, and these are like the large arteries leaving the heart. Large arteries directly leaving heart. So if you think about, here's the heart, here's the aorta. This is an elastic artery. And why is it, I know at least one person, Paloma will know this because we talked about this in physiology. What is the benefit of having this aorta? In the pulmonary trunk will be similar, to have this elastic quality to it, this stretchy quality. Anybody?
Regulate blood pressure.
Yeah, it's gonna be to keep the blood pressure from dropping to zero when the ventricles are in diastole, when they're relaxing. If you think about it, you know, the ventricles squeeze, they push the blood out. So it totally makes sense that your blood pressure is high when the ventricles are actually contracting and squeezing. But then like actually the majority of the cardiac cycle, the ventricles are relaxed and refilling. They're not pumping anything. The heart is offline. The heart is just getting ready for the next heartbeat and the next squeeze. So where does the blood pressure come from? Why does the blood pressure stay up above 0 when the heart is in diastole, when it's refilling? It's basically because when the heart is pumping and pushing the blood out, it's also kind of ballooning out the aorta. So the aorta is expanding because it's very elastic. And then when the heart goes into its refilling mode, now when the heart is in diastole, the blood can't go back into the heart because of this aortic semilunar valve. And now this kind of compresses down. And that's going to keep the blood moving forward by having that pressure by the large elastic arteries kind of starting to recompress as the heart is now relaxed. So that is these elastic arteries. The pulmonary trunk is also an elastic artery. Does that kind of make sense? And imagine, like, again, I've mentioned this in my other class. When I was a kid, we'd have these things called water weenies, where basically it's like surgical tubing, and you just fill it with water under high pressure at a spigot, and you get this big thing that looks like a big wiggly sausage, and this surgical tubing's really kind of expanded out. And then when you let go of one of the ends, the tube has all that pressure, and you get to spray your friends on a warm summer day. So it's the same basic idea happening here.